Good morning and welcome to the Utah Division of Drinking Water Enforcement webinar for April 29th, 2019. I am Colt Smith. I am sitting in the driver's chair today for this. We'll go through a couple of announcements and then dive right into the webinar where we cover the topic of enforcement and how it relates to water systems, how it relates to the Division of Drinking Water's primacy, and all the different types of enforcement that play out there. A few quick announcements first. We have some trainings coming up in the month of May. The AWWA starts off with their 15th annual Water for People Benefit Golf Tournament in Lehigh on May 7th. For more information on that, you can check the Intermountain section of AWWA's website. As well, Water Week kicks off in May from May 5th to May 11th and www.waterweek.org. And I'm sure we will have some interesting events going on here through our social media at the Department of Environmental Quality, as well as throughout the state. So please check there and be involved in that. AWWA is conducting a small systems training on May 23rd in Vernal that I am currently scheduled to participate in and conduct some training there, possibly on IPS 2020 and how that relates to you. And so please try and look in and see if you can register for that. The Rural Water Association is conducting a cross-connection control administrator certification training and program the May 7th through May 9th in Sandy, Utah. Please check the Rural Water website for more information on each of those trainings and how to register. That's an incredibly important training to start getting on now with some of the changes to the cross-connection control rule and requirements there that will help your system remain compliant and stay up to date on the best cross-connection control information out there. The Rural Water CPR and Basic First Aid training is on May 8th in North Salt Lake, another important one to have, one of the more fun trainings you can attend to as you learn stuff that's not just applicable to your daily work life, but to life in general. And then the Ways to Master Safety in Water Meters is a rural water training on May 9th in Tropic, Utah. And Rural Water System Security and Defense Forum is on May 30th in Bluffdale. I don't know how open that is or the registration for that, but it does have some information on a topic that we've covered here before in a webinar on cybersecurity and protecting water systems and critical infrastructure in that respect. So there are lots of opportunities coming up in the month of May for you to gain CEUs and better insight into managing and running your water system. Please check out the Rural Water websites or the AWWA website for more information and registration information for those. A couple of reminders and announcements. IPS 2020 is still in process and is coming. This is the year of the fix. If you have issues with your water system that could be impacted, start looking now to how you're going to correct that and the changes you need to make. Get a portal account on WaterLink and look at what IPS 2020 and how that could impact your system's rating and compliance status with the Division of Drinking Water. Start asking questions now. Don't be caught unaware. I have a little concern for most of you because you're the operators in water systems who are tuning in regularly to our webinars, so you're probably up to date and on top of everything. But let's start checking on that now. Seasonal systems. If you're a seasonal system that's opening up in the month of May and you're doing those procedures, make sure you submit that certification of how you did it to the Division of Drinking Water so that we know that you did it. One of the things we can talk about later when we get into the enforcement presentation is how some water systems have been caught up by not doing things like seasonal startup and how that's impacted them, not just with state compliance, but with federal compliance. Sample site plans. If we still do not have a bacteriological sample site plan submitted to the Division of Drinking Water, please do that now. Get with Janet Lee in our office or Satara Frederico, and let's talk about what we can do to get that taken care of. Always, and the reminder that is eternal and unchanging, check WaterLink. Always log in and be knowing what's going on with your system. See that the samples you've taken have gotten to the Division of Drinking Water and that we are all on the same page. That should be it for announcements and reminders coming up. If you have any questions, please let us know. I'm alone in the room today, so I don't have anybody to monitor the chat. I will check it at the end just to see if we've got any questions. And if not, you can always follow up with an email to me and we can get back to you on that. Diving in, what is enforcement? Enforcement is when a water system has failed to comply with the safe drinking water rules, they are a candidate for enforcement. Now, that's a pretty broad statement. Enforcement can cover, and rules are big and expansive. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Essentially, it's when a system has failed to meet monitoring or system requirements that can lead to us looking at enforcement. Monitoring MCL exceedances, failure to address deficiencies, or just a great lot of deficiencies on a water system, or major deficiencies, and a lot of IPS points that will lead into that. Another one could just be an immediate threat to public health. We've occasionally gone through enforcement because there's an immediate risk to public health and we need the water system to take action immediately. And so we issue an enforcement order to do so when there is a threat to public health. But as we dive into this, there's a few key terms you should know. This is not comprehensive. It covers most of the acronyms that are listed in our presentation, but it's certainly not all the acronyms that we use here at the Division of Drinking Water. And it's probably not even all the acronyms that we use in enforcement. ACS meeting is an Action Compliance Strategy meeting is what it stands for. We'll talk about that in a little bit. An AO is an administrative order. We'll explain exactly what that is in a slide. Bilateral Compliance Agreement, or BCA. This is a term we no longer use, but you may still see it referenced on a WaterLink report, or you may hear a staffer use it in conversation when referring to compliance orders because it's a change that was necessitated by another term on here and replaced, but you still may have it come up in conversation, so it's good to know. CAP is a Corrective Action Plan. CAO is a Compliance Agreement Enforcement Order. Again, we'll get into that deeply. That is what replaced the BCA. DDW is the U stands for Utah Division of Drinking Water. EPA is Environmental Protection Agency. ETT is Enforcement Targeting Tool, and we'll talk about what that is. IPS is the Improvement Priority System. I've already used that a few times today, but that's what it stands for in case you were unaware. NOV is a Notice of Violation. SNC, SNC, is Significant Non-Compliers. That's another retired term that you probably won't hear. You won't hear in this presentation necessarily, but you may hear it in conversation with a division staffer or an EPA employee because it's something that we were all familiar with years ago, and it's sometimes hard to change those habits. So it's just one to kind of know that you've heard it before. And then a TT, you'll see this pop up occasionally, it's a treatment technique violation, just so that we're all on the same page starting out with some of those key terms. This is the enforcement flow chart. It's probably really hard to read on your screen, especially if you're watching on your phone. But I do like to bring it up because it shows broadly, and we can get copies of this. I'd love to link to it on our website at some point, but it is a sort of an internal document just of how this works. We have a water system here that fails to sample or has quality violations or has a site visit that starts this. The staff notifies the system of the violation. Then the CAP, or Corrective Action Plan, is done to form the system to get to that point, or they fail to fix the violation on time. We'll talk about this all in depth. I just want this to be up here to go through really sort of quickly just to see the process that we go through. The IPS points might be exceeded at some point. The system will get a warning letter, and then the director will issue a rating change and require public notice of not approved. At this point, this is all sort of what we categorize as informal enforcement up to this point, and then it moves to formal enforcement over here. And then this middle section is sort of the process of transition from informal to formal. There's two types of formal enforcement: the compliance agreement enforcement order, and we'll talk about how that is. And then there's an administrative order, and then we'll talk about those as well. Then if a system fails to comply with the terms or conditions within those orders, they can be issued a show cause letter and failure to comply, and we go down that path to where it is referred to the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney Generals take it to district court. AG should be one of those terms I should add to that first slide that stands for Attorney General. The IPS rule. The IPS rule is one that when we've sort of done surveys on some of the ends of these webinars or based on our trainings, operators tend to understand this one. The broad basic of it is that points are assessed to a water system for failure to comply, be it with construction standards, with public notice or CCRs, physical deficiencies, operator certification, monitoring requirements, and those points accrue. As those points go up, a system can become a candidate for failure to comply. There are thresholds based on the type of system that you have. If you have a community water system, those go up to 150 points before you're a candidate that we're looking at rating not approved. 120 for non-transient, non-community, and 100 points for transient. And that's all sort of based on the fact that you have more opportunities to accrue points. A community system has more stringent sampling requirements, so they have more opportunities and have to take more samples to get those points. Points can be removed when you fix the deficiency, you take the samples. In the event of a bacteriological issue, however, they do take 12 months of operation before those points roll off. Systems ratings, whether you're rated approved, not approved, or corrective action, are generally based on the IPS score. The exception to that is the corrective action. Corrective action, that second rating type there, is when you're entered into a compliance agreement enforcement order, or CAEO. That is contingent upon your agreeing to fix the issues that you have placed before you. Approved means you're below the threshold and everything's good. Not approved is where problems start to happen. And water systems that are rated not approved are, one, a candidate for enforcement from within the division, and two, they can have a lot of issues impacting them on the local level. Some local health departments revoke food service permits to restaurants in not approved systems. We've had insurance companies refuse to pay out on homeowner insurance claims when they were hooked up to a not approved system. We've had banking institutions not approve mortgages for homes and home buyers when they're in a not approved water system. There are a lot of ripple effects from having your water system being rated not approved beyond just what we will do with enforcement here at the division. That said, that's not always going to be a lineup. That's not the only thing that puts you as a candidate for enforcement, like I said earlier, but those are the types of ratings, and those are generally based on the IPS rule. The IPS rule is coming under revision. We've talked about IPS 2020 on this webinar and trainings throughout the state. This is very close and is going through the formal rulemaking process now. We have had a few change, and this is not a webinar on IPS 2020, so I'm not going to dwell on it. We're going to give the very quick version of what it looks like. But the long and the short of it is that we've revised the rule based on public health risk and making it consistency in our ease of implementation. I shouldn't say ease. That's the wrong word there. It's more that it's our ability to make sure that our enforcement and our implementation is consistent, that it is current, and that a water system has every opportunity to remain compliant. We've had problems where the formal rulemaking process has slowed down a water system's ability to understand their IPS score. And this rule rewrite will help us make the IPS rule more dynamic, so that when we have federal rule changes, we can implement that in a timely manner here in Utah, so that water systems know what's happening and that we can actually communicate effectively with the water system and keep us all on the same page. Again, the IPS rule is always based on risk to public health. All points are based on the risk to public health and how that impacts. And then on that consistency note, when we talk in a minute about ETT versus IPS, you'll explain a little bit more in detail, but essentially we need our tracking system here at the state to match the federal tracking system. That's created some more problems with enforcement, both here for our staff and for water systems. How this process played out is the Division of Drinking Water, the director, it was one of Marie Owen's first big priorities when she took that job, to assemble a collaborative group of stakeholders to talk about how the IPS rule should work. Both DDW staff, LHDs, and other people to convene and talk about how we can revise this rule to make it simpler and more impactful for water systems. The rule rewrite will shorten the rule significantly, from roughly 38 pages to I think 3 or 4. It's going to move a detailed description of the deficiencies and points to a DDW policy document. that is going through a rewrite now to see how that will actually play out. The biggest thing is that IPS is going to be much better correlated with EPA's ETT, which, if this is your first time hearing that term, don't worry, we'll talk about it in a minute. IPS is coming in 2020, hence the term IPS 2020, and 2019 being dubbed the year of the fix. Fix the issues now. Let's not get hit with IPS 2020. So I've mentioned ETT a lot, and I've promised you the slide, and here it is, flowing directly into it. There's two different types of enforcement. We are overseen by the EPA. The EPA has granted the state of Utah primacy, which means we directly implement the Safe Drinking Water Act here in Utah. We are the authoritative voice on safe drinking water in Utah. But that doesn't mean that the EPA is not involved in Utah or take an interest in that. They have oversight over the Division of Drinking Water to see that we are doing our job and our due diligence to protect public health and ensure the safe drinking water for Utah residents. So there's two different types. Up here on the left is the ETT. That's the federal type. It stands for Enforcement Targeting Tool. And it's very similar to the IPS rule. It was the one that was formerly called SNCC, but it has some differences. It tracks only violations for monitoring violations, MCLs or maximum contamination levels violations, treatment technique violations, or CCRs and public notice violations, or when you come up on the ETT list. Points added for time of a violation on a list. That's different than the IPS. If you have a CCR violation from 2007 or 2018, you get the initial points for the violation, and then for failing to address it in 2019 or the subsequent year, you're added a point. So theoretically, a water system could have a single violation that if they ignore it for an extended period of time, it will continue to tick up on the EPA's enforcement list. That's different from ours. We give the violation once and it stays there, and then those points stay static. That's going to be something we're watching more carefully as we're tracking so that we are consistent. We do look at both the ETT and the IPS rule when we make compliance decisions. That's how that goes. Their threshold is 11. I always joke that this is because someone at EPA was a huge Spinal Tap fan, and so that our enforcement tool goes to 11 is the threshold for all systems, regardless of type. If you're a transient system and you're over 11, you're an EPA target. If you're a community system and you're over 11, you're a target. These systems, this tracking system goes to 11. A system over the threshold for 2 calendar quarters requires either state or federal action. This is becoming a much more bigger issue in the very, very recent past, like within the last 2 weeks, where citizens in Flint, Michigan sued the state and federal government the EPA, for failing to take action on a system that was non-compliant. And it actually went for damages. It's different than a citizen suit. We're not going to dive into the deep legalities of it, but essentially EPA is now very, very actively involved in looking at systems that are over the threshold of 11 for 2 calendar quarters, and will begin doing direct enforcement from a federal standpoint. If we fail to act, if you're not under a state enforcement order, you will and can be under an EPA order. And EPA will directly, and you will have to deal with compliance with the federal government, not just with the state government. It's a very expensive process and a very rigorous process to return to compliance under EPA. Our system, again, I've talked about this, so I won't get into it too differently. I'll just talk about some of the differences. Mainly, we track violations and the deficiencies. So we give you points for minor deficiencies that come up there. You only get points for a deficiency on the federal model if you don't correct a significant deficiency. And you get what's called a treatment technique violation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. We also have ratings, and the federal system doesn't have ratings. They just have time and that threshold. So broadly, that is how ETT differs from IPS. Formal versus informal. There are 2 types of enforcement. I talked about this briefly in the flow chart, but let's talk about what this really means. Informal enforcement has no penalty threat in it. It's a violation. We send you a violation for failure to take a sample, and then you take the sample and you return to compliance. There's no penalty associated with it. It doesn't come directly from the office of the director. It can come from a staff member, from a rules section manager, from Rachel's office, from Nathan Lundstedt in permitting. It can come from a rule manager. It's not coming directly from the office of the director. There's a few types of these. The NOV, the notice of violation, is an informal enforcement. Corrective action plans, which we'll talk about, or CAPs, are informal enforcement. Warning letters and rating changes. Rating changes are sort of in that weird middle ground where there's an order issued and it's where it's becoming formal, but it still doesn't carry that threat of penalty. It doesn't have the penalty involved in it. It does have a need to correct and fix, but there's not a financial penalty at stake. Formal enforcement, it has to include a financial penalty. It's going to include the ability for us to impose a fine. That doesn't mean we're going to send you a bill, but it means that the order, if you fail to address it, has the threat of penalty. It includes the specific items that need to be addressed. It definitely results in a rating change. And the types of formal enforcement are do not open orders, which could probably lie in the middle, but is formal. There is some stake if the violation there, so I chose to categorize it as formal. Compliance agreements, enforcement orders, and administrative orders are technically formal enforcement. We'll talk about CAEOs, or compliance agreement enforcement orders, in more in depth later, and why they have a penalty involved and what that means. But let's talk about a notice of violation specifically. Most water systems over the course of their lifetime will receive a notice of violation. The first thing to do is to not panic of getting one. It's going to come out from the rules section manager. Compliance is going to be run by a rules section staffer, or it'll come from rules section. We'll just go with that potentially. We'll just leave it there and keep it simple. This is informal enforcement, and it's tied to a single specific action usually. It's a missed sample. It's a failure to address a deficiency. It's not providing public notice. It's failure to do a single specific thing. It can be resolved without a rating change or going through any formal enforcement. You can take the next sample. If you get a nitrate violation, you go take a nitrate sample. We can resolve the notice of violation and return you to compliance. If you get a treatment technique violation for a deficiency, for not addressing a significant deficiency, you can correct that significant deficiency and we can return you to compliance without changing the rating of your system or issuing an order. Treatment techniques may require a CAO. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth on the next slide, but that's essentially what a notice of violation is that the violation has been issued. Treatment techniques. I hope this is visible to you if you're on a decently sized screen. Essentially, let's walk through this process. The first step is that a system is assessed a deficiency. This is a failing within your water system on a facility, typically. It could be something like not having a certified operator, so it's not tied to a specific facility, but let's just assume that it's something that is lacking within the system, hence the term deficiency. So that's assessed to you during a sanitary survey or a level 1 or 2 assessment or through notification that your operator certification is lapsed. So let's look at those 3 as just our basic types of treatment technique violations. There are some that are a little more specific, looking specifically with treatment. I'm not going to get into that nitty-gritty. This is a high-level view. Let's just go with the simple. So you assess that deficiency during a sanitary survey. Let's say you're missing a screen that is a significant deficiency. You're given 120 days from the time of the sanitary survey to correct that deficiency before a treatment technique violation is issued or points are assessed. It's 30 days on a level 2 assessment, so you have less time. But let's just say 120 days lapse for failure to fix that screen. And at that point, what's called a treatment technique violation is issued. This is the point where it's uploaded to the feds and becomes up on the ETT list, and where you can no longer do a corrective action plan, which we'll talk about next. If you take the corrective action plan, this is something you need to request before the 30 or the 120 days lapses, and it allows you more time to fix the deficiency. It's informal enforcement. We extend the deadline. It's basically asking for an extension either on a paper that you may have done, you've done that in high school or college, or an extension to file your taxes. It's asking for more time. I need more time to fix this problem. And that's going to be, if it's a screen, that might not be a big issue. But let's say that survey happened and then there's a massive snowfall and your tank, well, or whatever is inaccessible, or your system shut down immediately then after for the season, and you're going to need more time than 120 days to fix it. Requesting that cap will allow you to do that. Maybe you have to build a new storage tank, and doing that is going to require more than 120 days. You have a storage deficiency. It's going to be a longer process. That's when you're going to need to do that cap. You have to request the cap before the time elapses. Once the treatment technique violation is issued, you can't go back. You cannot go back and get the cap at that point. At that point, we're going to formal enforcement through CAEO. But let's talk about caps, corrective action plans. Again, you have to do this prior to the system getting the treatment technique violation and it going to feds. It slows that process. It does not get reported to Fed as a treatment technique violation. You have to act quickly following the assessment of the survey to get that. Once the violation is issued, again, we cannot enter into a cap. It only applies for facility points. You can't get one for monitoring. You can't say I need more time to go take my nitrate sample or my lead and copper samples. It can only apply to those those deficiencies. Be prepared for that, know how to do it when those surveys are done. We're entering into the heavy season of surveys, so start getting ready and know how to do that if you're going to need to do it. How to apply for a cap. You're going to need to know how to find your IPS report. Hopefully you're familiar with WaterLink, or if not, check out our other videos on how to use WaterLink 101 and learn how to check your IPS report. You're going to need to look at the deficiency and type codes and the name. You're going to write a detailed description of how you plan to resolve it. Do you need to obtain funding? Include that. Do you need to replace or rehab the entire spring? Do you need to build a tank? Are you planning to get an exception and you need time to gather spring flow data or to do these things? Write how you're going to fix the problem. Supply a date by which you will correct this deficiency. This should not exceed 1 year. Typically, caps are for no more than 1 year. The only exception might be as if you're a seasonal system, and so that you are only open for 6 months, and so you need 2 years or 6 months or 12 months of operation to address that deficiency. You can submit it to the Division of Drinking Water online at www.requestcap.utah.gov, and that will send an electronic form to us as well as an emailed version to you, and we will start processing the cap. We will prepare the cap here. Brandy Smith in our office manages these. Does a fantastic job of getting those out. We will send you a copy. You will sign it and return it to us. Rachel will sign it and send it back to you. And at that point, the cap is issued and your system stays rated approved, and you can begin fixing the problem. Another type of informal enforcement is the warning letter. This is the last chance that a system gets before enforcement really kicks in. And we start going towards formal enforcement. Generally, this is done when the system's IPS rating is above the threshold. We tend to address these quarterly at the ACS meeting, or Action Compliance Strategy meeting. Then you have typically you're given 30 days to take action. That may be more or less, depending on the nature of the issues and the type of system in play. You can return to compliance through taking the samples or fixing the deficiencies, entering into a corrective action plan, or getting a compliance agreement enforcement order. That's the timeline that you're given. Warning letters typically come at the director's discretion. She does not have to issue one. It is not required. We do it as a, let's make sure we have everything right. We know that sometimes there's lapses in data. We know that sometimes labs haven't submitted, or that you have samples that you just need to get to us, or that you've gotten to us and we're incorrectly labeled or entered. Call us early once you get that letter. Then we issue what's called a not approved order. This is technically informal enforcement under the EPA. It's more formal for us because at this point we're adopting those violations and they become director's violations, which doesn't matter a lot to you unless you're an attorney. But it's the first step to real formal enforcement. At this point, your system's been rated not approved. And RTCing, or returning to compliance, is a lot more difficult. You're going to have to start looking at everything you need to fix on that IPS report. This can be anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days. The timeline given to reach out to the Division of Drinking Water, for a CAO to return to compliance. At that point, this is where you need to be contacting us and working towards getting that compliance issue done. So I've said CAO a lot. What is a CAO? These were formerly called bilateral compliance agreements, or BCAs. You may still see that on some old IPS reports or referenced by staffers. These are systems that agree to collaboratively work to compliance with the state. Essentially what we're doing is we're entering into an agreement. We will draft the document. We will incorporate all the things you need to fix into it and put timelines in place that you'll have the ability to consult on. We will send you a draft version and say, how long do you need to fix this screen? Do you need 30 days? Do you need a year for X reason? And we can talk about it. We can talk with, if you have retained an engineer, we can talk with your engineer and ask them about what they need to fix the deficiencies. Additionally, what happens is the system's rating is turned to corrective action rather than not approved at this point. So your system, for the most part, if you're under corrective action, it's treated as if approved. From all those threats that I had beforehand, they're in place. However, you're still under formal enforcement. There's still penalties, risks for failure to comply. There's still the risk of referring to the AG because it's formal enforcement. It's big, like I said, for some of those things we mentioned earlier. This is still your best option if you've reached this point. And if you're going to need longer than a year to correct a significant deficiency, if a cap's not going to cover you, you may need one anyway to address that specific deficiency. You may need to enter into a corrective action plan to keep off of the EPA's radar and stay compliant with both us and the federal government. But let's say we send the warning letters, we send the not approved letter, and we've heard nothing from you heard nothing from the system. I shouldn't say you. It's not you. You guys are listening to the webinar. You're probably fine. But we've heard nothing from the system. That's where we enter into an administrative order, or an AO. This is like a CAO, except there's no collaboration. We're setting the deadlines based on what we consider reasonable and what our engineering section thinks is reasonable to fix a tank based on the best information we have available to us. There are still penalties in place. They're not immediately assessed. It doesn't come with a payment bill. But if you failed to ignore this order, then there is, again, a stiff penalty associated. It's one way. It's coming from us to the system. It is not input from the system. They are shut out of the negotiation process at this point. The other big benefit is that with the CAO, we can extend those deadlines. We can do a supplemental order to say, if you had construction plans for a tank and it was to be done by July, but it was a heavy snow year, you cannot safely get your construction equipment up there until June. So it's going to take you till September to finish construction. You can request an extension and we can grant it with a CAO. We can't do that with an AO. With an AO, that deadline is set. So let's say that the AO is ignored by the system and we go to failure to comply. The director issues a letter citing the items that the system has failed to meet to the system, and the system tends to have 30 days to respond to that letter. They can say, this is what we've done, this is where we're at, we're sorry for failure. They can sort of plead for mercy at that point to show what they've done. If that doesn't happen, the director will file a complaint with the Office of the Attorney General and request formal action, and the Attorney General files a motion in district court to compel compliance with the director's order. There's a couple of different things we can do. They can appoint a receiver. We can ask the court to appoint someone to run the water system and ensure compliance at cost to the system. We can do injunctive relief, which is where the judge orders the system to comply with the order. The system has the opportunity to contest this or to appeal this, but they tend to side with the state on those issues. Not necessarily always the case, but at that point, it's pretty far gone. Another big thing to note is that that AO is that there is a 30-day timeline to appeal it. You can file a formal appeal with the Office of the Attorney General for the AO, but after 30 days, it becomes final, and that's when it's enforceable. The deadlines stay the same. So even if you file the appeal against the administrative order, if there's a 30-day deadline in there, that deadline is still needs to be met. Just a couple of other terms we may throw out there, some sort of catch up the worst 25 list. This is a list of the highest IPS systems in the state that we go off of. We call it the worst 25 list, and that's one of our priority tools that we look at. That's an internal working document. But if you get a call from myself or someone else in the division saying you're on the worst 25, it means you're high up there. Historical IPS report is a report that we pull internally that shows the entire IPS history of the water system, every violation they've ever received over time. It helps us make a determination about enforcement decisions. Do not open orders. I touched on this lightly because we've just started using them, and they apply only to seasonal systems. But essentially, it's an order to a system that is not in operation, that is non-compliant with either IPS or ET, that they are not allowed to open until they return to compliance. We've sent some of those out this year to some systems that were non-compliant, and then we will check up, and if the systems are open and serving water, it becomes another enforcement avenue we go down. I didn't want to get too in-depth on it because it is very specific, but we do have that capability. Administrative points, you may see these. This is where the director can apply points to a system that are not tied to a specific violation. We've used them in time to reconcile when the IPS and the ETT are out of sync, where there's more points on ETT that's pushing them above 11, but they're below the threshold on IPS. Other items where we've used them is where a water system fails to show up for a sanitary survey. A surveyor scheduled or attempted to schedule a survey, and the water system either no-shows the surveyor or doesn't respond to any communication from the division on scheduling the survey. And we can assess points to make the system a candidate for enforcement just because there's a threat there. We don't know the extent of the damage or how bad the system is, and so we can err on that. That is at the director's discretion. Director may or may not use those depending on the situation. And then the other term I talked about, this action compliance strategy meeting. This is a quarterly meeting that's hosted by the division where we collaborate with our partners out in the state of Utah. Local health departments are invited, district engineers, and representatives from the Rural Water Association, large institutional systems that we regulate, Rural Community Assistance Corporation, RCAC, come together and we go through a multitude of reports to look at systems and discuss the best compliance strategies. It's a time for us to update our partners, and it is a time for us to set our priorities for the coming quarter for enforcement. We're coming up on that in the first week in May, so it's sort of a flurry of activity. Just a couple of tips to avoid enforcement or if you come under enforcement. If you're checking WaterLink regularly, you likely will never come under an enforcement order. One of the smartest things I ever heard was an operator at the Rural Water Association spring conference came up to me and said, I check my IPS report once a year before I come to the conference because I check my monitoring report every single month. I look to see that the samples that I sent in are there and are showing. And if they're not, I call and track down where they went. And then I know that there's nothing on my IPS report. That's incredibly salient. He should double check it. If he checks it annually and he's looking to see what's going on, he's going to know what's going on with his water system. Check the contact information in WaterLink. Make sure that the person who's listed as the responsible party is the responsible party so that the mail's going to the right place. Know where those NOVs are going. It's really sad for a water system when someone comes in and takes over and they had no idea that they were supposed to be doing things because the contact information was never updated with us. Check the monitoring, like I said, and check the IPS. If you get any type of letter from the Division of Drinking Water about a violation or a warning letter, and you don't understand exactly what's happening, call, email, and do everything in your power to get in touch with someone here and talk with someone about it early. We had a great situation earlier this week where early last week, where a system was under an order and they'd gone down the administrative order. Once they got the administrative order, they called, they set up a meeting, and they came in to meet with us. They came in to meet with us in the afternoon. The operator sat down. He provided all the information that he had for what he'd done to try and fix the issues. He needed help with the sample site plan. We were able to provide technical assistance that day and resolve a lot of his issues in a single afternoon of about a 2-hour meeting. That system's well on its way to returning to compliance. The earlier you get involved, the more proactive you are and can show me and show me as in the division, show what you're doing, the less likely you are to come under trouble for failure to comply with an order or to ever receive an order. Call us, email us, talk to us. If you're having trouble getting a hold of us, call the front desk and ask them to leave a Post-it note on our desk. We are extremely inundated with voicemails and emails, but we do our best to get back in touch with you and get in touch with someone here and let's talk about what we can do to fix it. Do your very best to comply if you're under an order. If you're under an order, you need to be in very close communication with the Division of Drinking Water staff to make sure that that's going well. Know your IPS 2020. IPS 2020, you can access that. If you get a portal account, and there's a webinar on our page about how to do that, you can look and see how IPS 2020 will impact your water system and start preparing for that and start fixing those deficiencies so that when when 2020 rolls around, and I'm holding that first ACS meeting of the 2020, your system is nowhere near my topic of conversation. If you have questions, contact us. If you have questions, you can call my office, 801-536-4155. You can mobile or text me at 435-610-1104, and you can email me at acsmith@utah.gov. I am in the enforcement, I'm in the rules section in the enforcement group. The other enforcement person is Brandy Smith, no relation, and we, or Rachel Cassidy, would be happy to help you understand any of the compliance issues that are taking place within your system. I'm just going to check the chat. And I don't see any questions appearing on the chat. So we'll round that out. If you need those CEUs, there should be a link in the comment section just below this video. You might have to click the show more, click that link, take the survey, fill out the quiz. There's only 2 questions and I answered them in this survey, in this presentation. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you in May.